Hi and welcome back. This is the second part of our look at the USA, and this week I want to start with a recap of some of the history of wine making in the USA. We saw previously that wines were first brought in by the missionaries in the mid-17th century, and then there was a later new wave of immigrants, particularly in the gold rush in California in the late 19th century, which brought in all their new European wine varieties and practices. In between these waves in the 17th century and the 19th century, there was also some attempts in the burgeoning United States after independence to make wine, particularly on the eastern seaboard, which was the hub of the emerging country. And there was already lots of native varieties in the area, Vitis Labrusca and Vitis rupestris and many others. They were the main two, as opposed to Vitis Vinifera, which is the true European or pan-European Asian vine that traditionally makes the grape varieties that we all know, like Cabernet, Chardonnay and so forth. Now, these native varieties are often described as having flavours that are a little bit feral, foxy, a little bit off. They don't really make wine that we would really consider to be in the sort of top drawer these days. There's a few exceptions, like Concord, which is still widely planted, and they still work well in some areas in America. They're much more widely planted than you might think, because we don't really see them here in the UK. Now, Vitis Vinifera, as imported from Europe, did generally make the superior wines with varying degrees of success. Didn't work in all places in America. It was just as well it started in California, because the eastern seaboard had a lot of problems. A lot of the vineyards failed. Mostly it emerged later this was due to Phylloxera, but there was lots of other problems with the climate, the humidity, that made it really not ideal for growing European varieties. One of the earliest people to plant vines in America was Thomas Jefferson, who's a figure you're probably familiar with. He was one of the first presidents of the United States. Before his presidency, he was actually the American ambassador to France, based in Paris. He lived there for quite a while, but he also travelled quite widely across France, learning as much as he could about winemaking. He also travelled into Italy and Germany to really broaden his knowledge, to take back to his home country, to really kickstart winemaking in the USA, which he thought had huge potential. He thought that those native vines as well were worth pursuing, things like Scuppernong, which is still in production today, makes a slightly sweet, quite viscous wine, and he thought that might be on a par with something like Chambertin, which I've got to be honest, it isn't. But it's interesting, these native varieties. Some of them are worth looking at if you're ever in the States. They're interesting wines from some of the better varieties, but generally I'm not a fan. While in France and during his presidency, he consumed, or rather ordered and bought, huge amounts of French wine. Some of the most expensive ones while he was president. After his presidency, some slightly cheaper wines, such as Muscats rather than Chateau Yquem and the top growths of Bordeaux. But there was also a discovery in the 80s by Hardy Rodenstock of some alleged Jefferson wines, and that's a whole other story. It's one that's well worth reading. It's a fascinating, slightly murky story, but quite interesting to look into. But in Monticello, he had his vineyards, didn't produce any wine for over 50 years during his lifetime, which is a shame because he was tireless in his efforts to promote the vine. During his presidency, he gave them tax breaks, and he invested in one of the first commercial wineries, so he really did kickstart the industry in a big way, and his influence is still being felt today. As president, Jefferson secured low taxation for wine as opposed to spirits. As part of his famous statement is that no nation is drunken where wine is cheap, because he felt that it should just be part of everyday drinking rather than spirits, which he felt were detrimental to your health and well-being of a nation. So there were essentially two wine scenes in America: the West Coast, California, that started earlier, and the East Coast with its trial and errors, hybrid varieties. Some of these hybrids were deliberately created with crossings, some of them were accidental, and did produce some good grape varieties. When Phylloxera reached California, it really was a turning point, because they realised that the only way to save the European vines was to graft them onto the American rootstocks, and this is what saved the American wine industry, and more importantly, the whole of the European wine industry, which was being wiped out in the 19th century by Phylloxera. So it was a hugely important moment. Without this, I don't know what the wine scene would look like today. It would be vastly different. Virginia, where Monticello is, still produces a modest amount of wine today. Wine is actually produced in all the states to a greater or lesser degree. Even Texas, you wouldn't think of it as a wine producing state, but there's a hugely growing wine scene there. It's actually fifth in terms of production in the USA. But the first area I want to look at is, picking up from California, it is directly above is Oregon. When I think of Oregon, the first thing that naturally comes to mind is Pinot Noir. It's 60% of the plantings there, followed by Pinot Gris and Riesling. So we're looking at some of the sort of cooler climate grape varieties here. This is at the north end of California, so we're heading up towards Canada. Much of the production in Oregon is much smaller scale compared to California. Yes, California does have its boutique producers, but it also has massive wine farms. Oregon's much more small scale. The main quality area here is the Willamette Valley, and it's sheltered from the west by the coastal range and on the east by the Cascade Range of mountains, which is tipped off with Mount St. Helens, the infamous volcano. This shelter, plus the fact that it's on the same latitude as Burgundy, gives its wines a distinctly Burgundian character. It's quite different from the ones from California with their sort of broader fruit characters. These wines are much lighter and paler, much more of European sensibility. Importantly, one of the first settlers in the Willamette Valley from outside was Joseph Drouin, the famous Burgundy negociant and wine producer. It was a real signal that this area was being taken seriously as an area for Pinot Noir production and quality wine production. He's based in the Dundee Hills AVA, which is one of the sort of hub of the quality wines in the Willamette Valley. And the first one we're going to look at today is from there, and it's the Sokol-Blosser sparkling wine from Dundee Hills. This is the Sokol-Blosser Evolution Sparkling Brut. It's a traditional method, sparkling, made from Müller-Thurgau, unusually, and a bit of Semillon and Riesling. An unusual blend for the area, but all cool climate grapes, planted up in the early 70s. It's got a lovely toasty, biscuity character from a little bit of lees aging. Quite different from a traditional champagne, if you're thinking of traditional method sparkling wine in its purest form. What's really coming through on that is the Müller-Thurgau and the Riesling. You've got that lovely Riesling, slightly honeyed character. It's very dry, but it's got that lovely sweetness of fruit to it. It's a perfect aperitif wine. To the east of Portland is the Columbia Gorge AVA, which straddles both Oregon and Washington states. Being further from the ocean, the climate here is much more definitively continental, but it's 900 metres above sea level. It's quite a bit higher than Willamette Valley, so you get that slightly cooling effect of the altitude, which keeps the freshness in the wines. The Cascades Mountain Range to the east of Portland also shelters the eastern part of Washington state, which is the next area we're moving into. If you think of Seattle, you think of rain. It's a very rainy city. The Cascades acts as a natural rain shadow, a bit like the Vosges Mountains in Alsace. So to the east of it, it is starkly different. It's almost desert conditions. So you've got a lovely sort of warm climate, but also very little rain, so irrigation is the key here. The plus side of this dryness is that disease is kept at bay. Even Phylloxera doesn't like this sort of dry climate, and particularly things like Pierce's disease, mildew, powdery mildew, all these different things that affect the vine aren't really present here, so there's much more consistency in the way they're able to grow the wines. Washington's the second largest area of production in the US, dwarfed by California, obviously. They produce vastly more than all the other states combined, but still an important area, and we're seeing a little bit more of a larger scale production here. It's slightly disjointed because Seattle is where most of the wineries are based, just outside Seattle, but the vineyards are nowhere near them, so they're sort of carrying the grapes to the vineyard, because the vineyards are much more of a touristy area where people actually go and visit. What's unusual about the whole of Oregon and Washington state is most of the vineyards are based around an area that was created in the last ice age. About 12 to 18,000 years ago, over in Montana, there was a huge ice dam about 30 miles across, and over the course of about 6,000 years, this periodically burst, releasing huge amounts of water that scoured out the Columbia Gorge, the Willamette Valley, all of these areas where we find vineyards today. It's where they found the best sites, and this is partly due to the fact that it's not that you've just got these lovely valleys, which are vines really love to grow in because of the different aspects you can get, but also there was lots of boulders, lots of stones that were thrown in while the valleys were being scoured out, and this gives lovely free draining but quite poor soils, which is what the vine needs. They love to get their roots right down about 40 metres or more, and they really thrive and produce their best fruit on quite poor soil. The subregions in Washington state include Rattlesnake Valley, Walla Walla, which I always think sounds like it should be in Australia, Yakima Valley, but most of the wine is bottled under Columbia Valley AVA, which is a huge area, or simply Washington state. Cabernet and Syrah both do well here, as do Chardonnay and Riesling, so you've got some of the cooler grape varieties that prefer this slightly cooler climate, but also Cabernet and Syrah can reach full ripeness in some areas as well. The next one we have is actually a joint venture between Chateau Saint Michel, one of the larger producers in Washington State, and Ernst Lucen from Moselle, who knows a thing or two about Riesling. This is the Eroica Riesling, off dry. Lovely ripeness on the nose, that lovely sort of honey, slightly herbaceous element, lovely lemon, slightly spicy character. One of the first things you notice on this, which is not typical of many American wines, is the sweetness. It's off dry, but it's got lovely honeyed sweetness from the Riesling as well as the residual sugar, and a really taut acidity. I had this at Bring Your Own Korean, and it worked really well with the delicate dishes like the sort of light chicken dumplings, but it also stood up to some of the quite spicy and punchy chili flavours as well. So across the board, it is a really good food wine. Crossing right over to the other side of the USA, the standout region here is New York State. There's some fantastic wines produced here, and it's a much more recent wine area than many. Dutch and Huguenot settlers in the mid-19th century were the first to plant the vine here, mainly in the Hudson Valley, just for domestic consumption. They weren't particularly looking to set up an industry, but later areas were settled like Long Island, which is sort of jutting out into the Atlantic Ocean. Very similar climate to Bordeaux, lovely maritime climate. So naturally enough, you get some really good Cabernets and Merlots from here, as well as some Chardonnay. A lot of it naturally being so close to New York City is based on wine tourism, but there are some good wines that are worth seeking out. The big area for me in terms of quality of production is the Finger Lakes region, which is in the northwest of the state, just under Lake Ontario. So you're actually heading up towards Canadian territory here. Coincidentally, it's another big important area for quality wine production. This area was actually also created by the last ice age, the last sort of glacial event. In this case, it was glacial erosion rather than flooding that created these areas, and they actually literally from the air look like huge claw marks in the earth, the Finger Lakes. The deepest one is Seneca Lake, which is the main sort of area of production, but there's the three other lakes around them also produce some really good wine as well. Wines are often labelled Finger Lakes region AVA, but some of them actually have the name of the lake they're from, such as the Seneca Lake, which is the next wine we're coming to. A lot of the wine produced in New York State, like a lot on the eastern seaboard, were made from these hybrid or native American varieties, and that still accounts for a lot of the production, particularly at the domestic end, at the cheaper end of the scale. There was some wine being produced in the Finger Lakes region, but it wasn't until the 1950s. There was a Ukrainian viticulturalist, Dr. Konstantin Frank, who, naturally enough, being from Ukraine, quite a cool area, was really good at identifying the best areas for growing cool climate vines. He did a lot of research and work around the Finger Lakes area, and really introduced vinifera vines, the European vines, to this area. He found that particularly Riesling and Chardonnay for white wine and Pinot Noir for red, on the correct rootstocks as well, that's quite important. They would just about reach ripeness while maintaining that lovely balance of acidity as well in this area. The importance of the vineyards being around the lakes is that during the summer, when it can get quite hot, don't forget this is in the continent, so you get hot summers, freezing cold winters, the lakes act as a tempering and moderating influence on the temperature, but also they're stored heat. So as the temperatures drop in the autumn, the lake's released like a radiator, enough of this heat just to push the vines over into that full ripeness before they're picked. So it's a very sort of marginal climate here, but perfect. I often think that the best wines are made in areas where the climate and everything else is almost on a knife edge. So you do get this balance in the best years that gives the wines lovely poise and elegance, which I hope we will be seeing in this Pinot Noir. So this is the Forge Vineyards Pinot Noir, Seneca Lake. And as soon as I pour this out, I can immediately see what it says to me is this is a cool climate wine simply because of the depth of colour in the glass. If you hold it against a light background, you can see right through it. This is a really light Pinot Noir. And again, I'm getting that on the nose. There's that lovely Pinot fragrance, but very light, very fresh. Lots of cherry fruit in there rather than some more jammy flavours you might get from a warmer climate such as Chile. It's a beautiful, light, fragrant Pinot Noir. And it really emphasises for me that cool climate around the lakes in New York. If you think of how far north this is, we're nearly in Canada here. This is a really lovely wine. It would go perfectly with charcuterie, something quite light. Often Pinot Noir is described as going well with roast duck. This is not a big wine. This is lovely, light and fragrant. Anyway, thank you for joining us this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. And next week, we will be traversing the Atlantic back into the Old World. Cheers.